Ramachandra Guha, one of India's foremost environmentalists and historians, recently came out with a new book, Speaking with Nature, about the environmental movement in India. Down to Earth caught up with Ramachandra Guha while he was in Delhi and asked him questions ranging from the third environmental movement that he speaks about in his book, lack of a green party in India, and the development versus environment paradigm.
It's a misconception to posit development against environment. It's a juxtaposition that is very common in the literature. It's a juxtaposition favored by industrialists and politicians because partly out of ignorance, because they don't have an understanding of the deep environmental problems we face, partly because they feel that environmentalists are against development. But the argument of my book is that in a country with much higher population densities than Europe and North America, where tropical ecologies are much more fragile because of the monsoon than temperate ecologies, and finally because unlike Europe and North America, India does not have access and did not have access to colonies whose resources they could exploit. India has to adopt a much more environmentally sensitive form of development, and that takes into account community rights. So, it's a combination of social justice and environmental sustainability. And those are the arguments articulated in the 70s and 80s by movements such as Chipko and Narmada and others. It is true that if you look at popular movements, if you look at non-violent civil disobedience, the 70s and 80s were the high water mark. But at the same time, among young people today, there is a very great awareness of the environmental crisis, both domestic, both things like depletion of groundwater resources, air pollution and biodiversity, both issues that are unconnected with climate change and issues that are connected with climate change and made worse by climate change. Awareness among young people, which has grown a great deal in the last few decades, does not translate into attention in the mainstream media. It does not translate into politicians having a ear to it and responding to it. But I think the fact that you do have among the younger generation a much greater awareness of the environmental crisis than my generation had, or even your generation had when you were a student, right? It will lead to action, it will lead to activism, it should lead to putting proper pressure on the government and the industrial classes who are the main polluters. The last thing I'd say, again compared to the 1980s, in the 1980s, the environmental debate was led by grassroots movements and by journalists. Today, we did not have too many scientists working in this field. The last 40 years, India has developed a great amount of scientific expertise in ecology, in hydrology, in soil science, in biodiversity, in pollution abatement, in urban planning, in energy management. If this scientific energy is harnessed, scientific expertise is harnessed, it can lead us to a sustainable path. It's tragic that these scientists, Indian scientists, are never consulted, or if they are consulted, their recommendations are ignored, which is what happened with the Gadgil committee, and you know what the consequences of the neglect of the Gadgil committee report was. So the situation is not very promising, but it's not as bleak as one might expect because of the growing consciousness among the young, and because we have what we never had before, really good high quality scientific expertise to forge sustainable policies. What I've tried to do is study the past to illuminate the present, but I can't project into the future. What I'm saying through this book is that in our political history, in our intellectual traditions, in our national movement, we have intellectual exemplars who can inspire us, who can guide us, who can deepen our thinking of what India needs. Now, how these ideas are taken forward, I can't say, but I'll say one thing. One of the implicit arguments of the book, it is made in the introduction to the conclusion, is that even if climate change did not exist, India would be an environmental disaster zone. So, I'm speaking to you in Delhi in the last week of October. I came today from my hometown Bangalore, where the air quality index is about 60, Delhi today is 360. Now, this is, and it's going to get worse. This has got nothing to do with climate change. The problem, air pollution and its impact on the health, particularly of the working poor, is independent of climate change. The depletion of groundwater aquifers in the Punjab and elsewhere is independent of climate change. The death of our rivers is independent of climate change. Deforestation, decline of biodiversity is happening through misguided policies independent of climate change. So even if climate change did not exist, we would be facing an existential crisis. Climate change makes it worse because the unanticipated consequences of a flood, a fire, a drought make our economic and environmental and social situation worse. So, but young people should recognize that climate change is an add-on, that the problems are more deep-rooted, they are independent of climate change, and which is where these thinkers come in, because these thinkers were writing and arguing and reflecting. Even before climate change, they were saying we have to forge a much more caring, sustainable, equitable path towards economic progress than what the West has laid down. The epigraph to the book quotes Gandhi as saying that if India takes to industrial exploitation after the manner of the West, it will strip the world bare like locusts. But that is an intuitive understanding. He didn't develop it further because Gandhi was involved in so many other things. So he wasn't really an environmentalist per se, but his instinctive understanding that India needed to adopt a different path towards economic security was taken up by some of his followers. One of the reasons Germany has a very progressive environmental policies is that the Green Party, which was started in the early 1980s, started getting 6, 7, 8, 10% of the vote. They joined the government. Even if they didn't join the government, they were effective opposition force in the legislature, raising these issues. Sometimes they had to join the government, in a coalition government, they joined the government. A system of proportional representation is better generally. Whatever reason our founding fathers didn't choose it in 1950 when the constitution was framed, and it's unlikely we will move away from it because there's inertia, and but that is the reason why it's hard to imagine a Green Party. But that does not mean we cannot have more green activism, mobilization, and it's a combination of not just green and red. I mean, the argument of my book is, in a country like India, environmental sustainability, the search for environmental sustainability is inseparable from the search for social justice, because it's the poor, the dispossessed who suffer most from environmental abuse.
Thank you for listening to us. For more of such videos, subscribe to Down to Earth's YouTube channel.